All right, so this will be the final video, and I had thought that I was finished with classical conditioning, but there was actually one last thing that I wanted to talk about. And I did want to make sure you're aware of the fact that classical conditioning is a major contributor to phobia. So we didn't talk too much about phobias when we did the abnormal psychology component of the course. But phobia, of course, is an anxiety disorder, and quite often classical conditioning has contributed to phobia. So, for example, let's say when I was young, I had a really bad dog bite from a growling, snarling German Shepherd. Well, because the appearance of that German Shepherd is a reliable predictor of a bite, that's going to make me frightened of German Shepherds. But we also see a process known as generalization. And with generalization, what we see is that I may also be fearful not just of German Shepherds, but maybe of other large dogs, or maybe even small dogs. Perhaps even a German Shepherd stuffed animal is going to give me a certain level of fear, because in my mind, I've convinced myself that the appearance of that German Shepherd, even the stuffed animal, is a predictor of the pain. And phobias are actually treated using a process known as extinction, and the book gets into this. But this is where you present the conditioned stimulus, like the picture of that perfectly normal, happy German Shepherd, followed by nothing. And because in my mind, I think that the German Shepherd is going to be followed by pain, if my therapist and I continue to work and I see that stuffed animal German Shepherd is followed by nothing that's painful. And then maybe a German Shepherd that's outside my window, that is followed by nothing that's painful. And then I pet the German Shepherd, and that's followed by nothing that's painful. Basically, the process of extinction is where you have the CS followed by nothing. And so when the CS reliably predicts nothing, it loses its meaning. And so this is one of the classic ways that phobia is treated. It's a process known as systematic desensitization, because you're trying to get the person desensitized to the phobic object so that it no longer has any meaning. So in terms of explaining other types of phobia, many people have phobias of water, perhaps because they had an early near drowning accident. So that water was a predictor of drowning. And I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. And now we can move on to operant conditioning. All right, before we really talk about principles, I just wanted you to read over this little Dear Abby column that I wrote up. And I want you to think about whether or not you see any evidence of punishment or reinforcement at work. So what might the author of this letter, Fed Up, what might she be doing that could actually be causing the problem to get worse? I'm certainly not in the business of blaming victims of emotional abuse, but in this scenario, I definitely see where she is doing something to maybe make the situation worse. So I want you to think about, do you see any evidence of examples of punishment or reinforcement? And then also think about what could she do that would actually make the situation a little bit better. So pause the video, give some thought to that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it. So I really like to use this example because quite often when two people are in abusive relationships, there is a dynamic where the victim can sometimes actually be making things worse by being overly nice to the bully, for lack of a better word. And hopefully you picked up on that. So what we see is that his bad behavior, bossing her around, being grumpy, is being followed by positive consequences. She's nicer to him. So she is actually reinforcing his bad behavior. And that means she's making it occur more and more frequently. And we actually see that in her letter. And of course, her nice behavior is being followed by negative consequences of him being grumpy. So that's punishment. We should see that her nice behavior is going to decrease. That may or may not happen. One of the things that I really like when I do some group discussions about this question is I get a variety of ideas on how she might be able to fix the problem. A lot of times I'll have some students who will say, well, she should just be mean and grumpy right back. So the idea is that she should try to punish his bad behavior. And as I'll talk about in a later slide, quite often punishment just ends up breeding more aggressive behavior. So many psychologists do not recommend punishment, except in just a few isolated instances, and the book gets into that. Because quite often what punishment does is it just tells you what not to do. It doesn't tell you what you should be doing. And also punishment ends up escalating the situation and making it worse, and perhaps making the situation physically violent. Instead, it would be a really good idea if she could use the process of extinction that I just mentioned in a previous slide, where his bad behavior is followed by nothing. And that might seem kind of counterintuitive, but there is evidence that when a bad behavior is followed by no consequences, it starts to lose its value. I mean, he had gotten used to the fact that when he was mean, she would be nice to him. If she stops being nice to him, that's going to be pretty noticeable. If every time he's grumpy, she either just gets up and walks out of the room, or maybe a slightly more mature fashion saying, I'm not okay with the way you're treating me, and then gets up and walks out of the room, him being grumpy really loses its purpose. And we see the same thing going on if you've ever watched Super Nanny, where kids are misbehaving, and instead of mom or dad lashing out and yelling at them, which doesn't work, sometimes parents put the kids in timeout, which is essentially removing all kinds of pleasurable consequences. Or in some cases, if kids are throwing temper tantrums and they're not in any danger and they're not actually in need of anything, sometimes parents are encouraged to just walk away or to turn their back until the kid can act properly. And quite often this process of extinction, where the bad behavior is followed by nothing, can actually have some pretty quick turnarounds in behavior. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so I've already used the terms punishment and reinforcement. These ideas I think we're pretty used to. So reinforcement is any time that you deliver a consequence that causes a behavior to increase. That's reinforcement. So the goal of reinforcement is to increase a behavior. Punishment is what we say whenever a consequence causes a behavior to decrease. So reinforcement increases behavior, punishment decreases behavior. And those basic concepts are pretty easy to get. Within the field of reinforcement, however, I want to make a distinction between positive reinforcement, which I think we're all very used to, and negative reinforcement, which is a little more foreign. So with positive reinforcement, you are presenting something that's pleasant. And of course, when somebody receives something that's pleasant, they're likely to continue doing that behavior. So your child uses their manners and you give them a pretty sticker. Well, the sticker is pleasant. You are positively reinforcing them for using their manners. So we're all pretty familiar with that. The one thing that people are often not very familiar with is a concept of negative reinforcement. And with negative reinforcement, in this case, we will do a behavior. That's what tells us it's reinforcement. We will do a behavior, but we do it simply to avoid or escape something that is unpleasant. So for example, I drive the speed limit in order to avoid getting a ticket or getting into an accident. I will study. If I'm a student, I might study simply to avoid getting a bad grade. Drug users, once they are addicted to the substance, and many people who are addicted to cigarettes will say that they smoke purely to avoid the cravings and the withdrawal symptoms. And so in that case, smoking is being negatively reinforced. The reinforcement is it allows them to avoid or escape something that's unpleasant. And I have a picture of this little kid. I think that's Suri Cruz right there, Tom Cruise's daughter. And you can see that the caption on the side says, "You will buy me that candy or I will ruin you in public." And so I think anybody that has kids has certainly witnessed their children using negative reinforcement on them. So quite often you might have a kid in the checkout aisle who's throwing a little hissy fit, and the parents will give in and buy candy. Well, the parents buying candy, that is a behavior that's being reinforced. How is it being reinforced? It allows them to escape their kid's temper tantrum, because of course as soon as they get the candy they stop crying. So kids and animals will often train us to do things, certainly through positive reinforcement, but also through negative reinforcement. I let my dog outside. That behavior is being reinforced because he stops barking, right? So negative reinforcement, the whole point is that we do a behavior to avoid something that is painful or unpleasant. Punishment, on the other hand, is something we're a lot more familiar with. In this case, the whole goal is to decrease a behavior. So you see the mom over here who's going to give her daughter a spank. Maybe the daughter said a curse word. So mom wants to decrease her daughter's cursing by spanking. Punishment is something that we tend to go to very easily. It's often what we do automatically. It takes sometimes a little bit more creativity, a little bit more thought, a little bit more self-control to use something else. So punishment is a very natural response, but there are a number of problems with punishment. I mentioned a couple of them earlier. For one thing, it needs to be done every single time in order to be successful. So if that little girl curses and doesn't get a spank, woo! I mean, cursing is fun when you're young. It's cool. So there's a lot of reinforcement to it. So unless you as a parent or you as a romantic partner can be around every single time to punish a behavior, and let's face it, you're not going to be, punishment's really not effective. Another problem is that punished behavior is temporarily suppressed, but it's not forgotten. So when that mom spanks her daughter for cursing, the daughter may temporarily stop cursing, but as soon as she gets away from mom, bam, that cursing is going to come right back. As I said before, also punishment only teaches what not to do. So if a child gets punished for doing a particular behavior, okay, now they know that they're not supposed to do that, but they don't know what they're supposed to do instead. So mom smacks her daughter when she curses. The daughter knows that, okay, I'm not supposed to curse, but what do I do when I'm upset or when I'm angry? How else do I express my emotions? And that's really problematic, I think. Another thing that's really problematic is punishment, of course, is, in the spanking example, it's certainly a case of violence, but it can create fear and avoidance. If every time my dog barks, I yell at him or I spank him on the bottom, what I'm teaching him is that I am a scary being and he needs to be fearful of me. I'm not really teaching him to not bark. I'm teaching him that I'm bad. And of course, we really don't want to do that with our pets or our loved ones or others around us.
Okay, now I get to the part that probably everybody has been waiting for, which is the information that will be necessary for the responses that you're making on the discussion board. And by the way, I have changed locations. I am now at home, so you might hear the fish tank in the background. But I have just two last slides on how we can change behavior. And so I have in the background here in my pictures some common things that we might want to change. So nail biting, having a messy house or a messy room, dog biting. These are three things, and I'll try to draw on them when I'm discussing each of these ways that we usually try to decrease a bad behavior. Now, the most obvious one is number 3, punishing the behavior. So, for example, some students have suggested when I've done this kind of exercise, well, every time I bite my nails, I'm going to smack my hand. Well, that doesn't work because punishing yourself, that's not going to be something you stick with for very long. And I've already said that if every time your dog barks, you hit him, well, that's not going to work because it's just going to create fear. Now, another thing that we can do is to prevent the behavior by force. So you could muzzle your dog, or you could sit on your hands. But as you might imagine, this really isn't a permanent solution. It's very temporary, and of course, as soon as you take the muzzle off, or as soon as you lift your hands out from underneath your legs, bam, the desire to do it is going to be right back again. So you haven't actually learned anything new. Another technique that is a little bit more successful is you can extinguish the behavior. So this is something I was talking about when we were doing the little Dear Abby letter. So for example, using the dog barking, sometimes if my dog thinks that he's going to go for a walk, he gets very excited and he starts barking. And a lot of times it's because I've gone upstairs to get my shoes, I come back down, and as I'm walking down the stairs, he starts barking. And sometimes if I purposefully turn around and walk back upstairs and just sort of stand up there, he stops barking. And so what I've done is I have, not very effectively, quite frankly, but the goal is to extinguish his barking behavior by ignoring it. I'm taking away any of the reinforcement value for barking. I will tell you that it works sometimes, but it certainly hasn't had any long-term success. Okay, and the final thing, there we go. The final thing that I wanted to talk about was using negative reinforcement. This is usually something that isn't really ideal, but for example, if my teenage child had a very messy room, one of the things I might do to try and get her to pick it up is to say, oh my goodness, you are so lazy. Why aren't you picking up your room? And I engage in criticizing or nagging to try and get them to change their behavior. And eventually the teenager might pick up their room, but they're doing it purely to avoid my nagging, purely to shut me up. And as you might imagine, that's not really going to create a very positive relationship and probably not any kind of long-term change. And so there are better ways to do it. And I want you to think about these techniques when you are responding on the second discussion board. One thing that we can do is reinforce the kind of behavior that you want to increase. So for example, if any time I go to my little leash basket and my dog doesn't bark, he's being quiet. Well, that's the desired behavior. And so I can just praise the dickens out of the fact that he's being really quiet. And when he barks, that's when I ignore him. So it's kind of a two-stage thing. I am not reinforcing at all his negative behavior and only reinforcing what I want him to do. Kind of along the same lines, it might also be possible to reinforce an incompatible behavior. So for example, if the issue you wanted to change was biting your nails, you could think of, okay, what is something that is more or less incompatible with biting my nails? So sometimes people will put on a really attractive nail polish or some kind of hand lotion that smells really good but doesn't taste good. And so in either of those cases, the nail polish or the lotion would be reinforcing. It's pleasant, but having nail polish or lotion on your hands is kind of incompatible with happily biting your nails. And so those, both of those are really things that I strongly encourage you to consider when you're offering your classmates some suggestions. Number 3 is very similar to number 1. You reinforce anything but the bad behavior. This can be a little exhausting. I guess it depends on how much you hate the bad behavior. So anytime my dog does anything other than barking at leash time, he gets told that he's a good boy and gets some treats. And number 4 is also one that I encourage you to consider in addition to some of these other change techniques. Think about what is the motivation for the behavior. So if we're dealing with nail biting, why do people bite their nails? Part of it's anxiety, part of it's boredom, part of it might just be having an irregular, snaggety nail. So if you can try to address the motivation by having to be a fingernail clipper or nail file, or finding another way to deal with your boredom or relieve your stress, by addressing that motivation, you're going to be better off. Why might my dog be chewing on the carpet? Because yes, he chews on the carpet. Well, it's probably because he's a little bored if we leave him alone for a few hours. Okay, how can I address the motivation for that? It means not leaving him alone for as long, or maybe giving him other toys. So a lot of times that step number 4 goes really well with some of the other steps. All right, that's the last slide in this presentation. So consider these, brainstorm some ideas to give suggestions to your peers for the discussion board. And I encourage you to think about some of these techniques when you are trying to modify some of your own behaviors. That's all, folks.